they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him."
When Jesus arrived in Bethany, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to Jesus, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" Martha said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you're the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here, and he's calling for you." And when she heard it, Mary got up quickly and went to Jesus. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to Jesus, "Lord, already there's a stench because he's been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Please pray with me. Might words spoken and words heard, and the spaces in between, unbind our hearts, our minds, our very souls. Our reading from the Gospel of John is one of the longest lectionary passages of the year. Indeed, we've divided it into two sections. Yet despite its extraordinary length, it contains within it what is reputed to be the shortest verse in the Bible. John 11:35. Jesus began to weep. Or the even shorter verse from older translations, Jesus wept. How simple, how straightforward. Jesus comes to Bethany and finds his friends Mary and Martha in mourning because their brother and Jesus' friend Lazarus has died. So Jesus weeps. With all our questions and concerns about life after death, we could gloss right over that part of the story. We could skip ahead to the way Jesus calls Lazarus out of the grave. We could just go right to the moment when Lazarus is unbound and unwrapped, his linen grave clothes cast aside as he wanders out into the daylight after having been in the grave for 4 long days. We could do that, but Jesus wept, and so must we. You see, even though as Christians, most, if not all of us, believe that something lies beyond this life, even though many of us believe we shall be united in some way we maybe can't fully understand with our loved ones in some heavenly future, even though those things are true, we too must stop and weep. Not just when those we love most closely die. Even when strangers die, we often stop and weep. We see a picture on television of a malnourished child from South Sudan who dies of starvation, and we weep. We hear about a mother whose life is cut short by terrorist bombs, and we shed tears. We read of a high school student mowed down by gun violence in Fort Myers, and we openly cry. For all these strangers, we find ourselves weeping. One scholar notes that this verse, Jesus wept, serves as a truly authenticating mark of Jesus' humanity. And so too, sisters and brothers, with you and with me. For when we weep, we are often at our most authentic place. We are most human. I've often presided at memorial services where family members and friends offer up eulogies, tributes in honor of the deceased. And very often, one or another of the speakers will break down and begin to cry in the midst of their words. Inevitably, they will apologize. "Excuse me," they'll say as they wipe away tears, as they blow their nose, as they compose themselves. I'm sorry," they'll mutter as they return to their script. But they needn't apologize. Their tears, their weeping, it's not a distraction. It is a testimony to the depth of their love, a witness to their devotion to the one who we have gathered to remember. They need not apologize for their tears. When you're parent or your grandparent, someone you've known literally your whole life long, dies, when your spouse of decades passes on, when your beloved son or daughter succumbs to death, when your very best friend in the world passes on, of course you stop and weep. It is profoundly human to do so. Yes, as Christians, we have hope that there is more to the story. But for the moment, in the here and now, there is a real loss. There is a hole that can't be readily filled. There is an aching emptiness that hurts beyond belief. Of course we stop. Of course we weep. It was July 26, 2009. Emma, Allison, and Katie Hance were driving home from a camping trip with their Aunt Diane. They were as close as sisters can get. These three little girls adored one another, thought of themselves as best friends, and they were. And they often spent time with their aunt. But this day something was off, something was wrong. Aunt Diane didn't seem to be herself. Her driving was a bit erratic. One of the girls called her mother and in a somewhat panicked tone said, "Something's wrong with Aunt Diane." And then when they started down the Taconic Parkway in upstate New York, they realized they were going the wrong direction. And an SUV struck their vehicle. Only Diane's son, Brian, survived the crash. The other driver and the passengers died. Diane died. And so too did Emma, Allison, and Katie. Their mother, Jackie, understandably went into a tailspin. And when the later autopsy revealed her sister-in-law very well may have been drunk and high, it became unbearable. Jackie is Roman Catholic, and as she considered suicide something prohibited in Catholicism, she even talked with more than one priest to make certain God would see her special circumstances and not pass judgment. Through it all, Jackie was held up by friends, though, who were determined that that would not happen, and they tended to many of her needs, staying at her side, cooking meals, taking her out shopping, but the ache was deep and real. Her husband, Warren, moved in another way, and their marriage was on the verge of collapse. 2 years later, she told a reporter, "Warren and I have struggled with our grief and the differences in how we grieve. He copes by staying busy and not trying to think about it. I need to talk." In time, things improved for Jackie, but her grief didn't suddenly end. And 6 years after the accident, after the deaths of her 3 precious little girls, she still found herself needing to weep. She developed a routine, a pattern of grief that worked very well for her. Every morning, often before the sun hit the horizon, she would get up early and go out running with her friends, usually about 6 miles. And then after she got home, she would take some time to be alone, some time to cry. "That's when I allow myself to be sad," she told author Janet Kaplan. "I take 5 minutes to cry because I miss my girls. And then I make myself write down what I am grateful for." Jackie Hance learned that sometimes you just have to stop and weep. Though there may be many things for which you are still grateful, things, she says, like the sun warming her face and healthy legs that allow you to run, that doesn't mean you can't still grieve. It is not a sign of weakness to grieve. It is rather an acknowledgement that your loss is real. And while it might not be as rough around the edges as it once was, it is an acknowledgement that the whole is still there. And so you must stop. And so you must weep. So Jesus wept. Jesus shared in the grief his friends were experiencing. And though he may have known full well what was coming next, he must have also realized that even if Lazarus was brought back from the dead, brought back to life, he would always carry about him the stench of death. Perhaps not literally, but most certainly figuratively. People would forever be talking behind his back, "Hey, look, it's Lazarus. Wasn't he the one Jesus raised from the dead?" Jesus knew Lazarus' life as he had known it was over. And so Jesus wept. Jackie Hance understood that as well. Life as she had known it was over. No longer would her home be filled with the giggles and laughters of three close little girls. Indeed, it appeared there would never again be childhood laughter in her home, for after Katie, the youngest, had been born, Jackie had had a tubal ligation, and in vitro fertilization was out of the question. It was cost prohibitive. But then a doctor named Zev Rosenwachs volunteered his services free of charge. And in time, Jackie became pregnant. She named her new baby daughter Casey Rose. Casey with a K. It was a name that utilized the first initial of each of her deceased daughters. And the middle name, Rose, was in honor of the doctor who had made it possible, Dr. Rosenwachs. Little Casey soon filled Jackie's days with great joy, a real resurrection, if you will. But even at that, sometimes Jackie still had to stop and weep. Every year she writes letters to her deceased daughters on their birthdays as a way to remember and a way to mark their place. While some would call such a practice morbid, for Jackie, it is simply a way to cope with her loss, a way to allow herself the tears that she still needs to shed. In one of those letters to Allison, Jackie spoke of how she still missed her. This year, she wrote, "My birthday gift to you, Allison, is this list of what I have learned to be grateful for since you went to heaven." And then she listed her faith, her ability to love, and how much it meant to have people in her life who care. People like a friend saying a prayer, sending a card, stopping by with coffee, or taking Casey for an hour so I can have fun, so she can have fun. And also, so I can be sad. These mean the world to me. When someone we love dies, we do indeed need to find ways to cope, to go on, to live life the best way we can. Even as Jesus did when he learned that his dear friend Lazarus had died. But we also need to be willing to allow ourselves to grieve. And we need to allow others the time and space they need to grieve as well. We all do it in different ways. And like Warren and Jackie Hance, we may discover those ways don't always mesh as comfortably as we would like. But that too is all right. Death ends life here on earth for the deceased. But it also changes life for the living. And for most of us human beings, any change is hard. But some changes are harder than others. And so sometimes we weep. Sometimes we must. But our story from John has another reminder, for it reminds us that when we do weep, we can take comfort in knowing that Jesus also wept. And in some mystical way that I can't even begin to explain, whenever we grieve, Jesus weeps with us. Because isn't that what friends often do for each other? Mary and Martha had a real friend. And so do you. So do I. What a friend we have in Jesus. All our griefs to share.